Hi, I'm Angus Cress Gillespie, your host for East Brunswick Television. I'm here today with Professor Allan Isaac of the American Studies Department of Rutgers University. Professor Isaac specializes in Asian American topics. He received his PhD in comparative literature from New York University. His most recent book is Filipino Time, Affective Worlds and Contracted Labor. Allan, congratulations on the publication of your new book, Filipino Time.
Thank you.
As a layman's understanding of the term Filipino time, it means like if I'm hosting a party and I want people to arrive at 6, I'll announce that the party starts at 5 because they will be routinely about an hour late. But I assume that's not what your book is about, per se. It's a play on words, I assume.
That's absolutely right. And by the same token, if you are invited to a party, sometimes people think it's rude for people to show up early or on time.
Yes.
Because they would assume, and it's like, well, who goes to parties exactly on time? You're supposed to give the host 30 minutes leeway at the very least.
To get ready.
Yeah.
Because
otherwise it would be rude. But I think this is part of the way that social life works and society works with this understanding of different rhythms. And I think that's true in a lot of countries and cultures and traditions in which time is very different from the way we understand it, obviously, in the West, in the US. But even within the United States, we have sort of like a notion of different types of ways to deal with time. Yeah. So you're right, Filipino time actually will be understood by Filipinos throughout the world as somehow always an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours late, and the way that time is sort of flexible and versatile.
But instead, what is the main idea of this book?
Right, so what I'm thinking about here is that, as we all know, in New Jersey, there are many Filipinos who are actually recruited to work in hospitals, for example, as nurses or as teachers in our school systems, whether it's special education or whether it's math and science. And of course, every day people would probably reach out for help for technical or other sort of like services on the phone where they're call center agents.
Yes.
But so every year, about 10% of the Filipino populations work abroad, and many of the families who are back home in the Philippines depend on that income from abroad. And so for me, so two things about Filipino time. Number one, the labor time that Filipinos give to the rest of the world as recruited labor and workers, but it's also the idea that there is a way by which it's a different sort of work, right? It's what what others call affective work. It's not a product that Filipino workers produce. We don't produce a product, but we produce sort of like this other type of work, whether it's nursing or teaching or caregiving or even call centers, and that's called affective work, that we smooth things out, whether it's about health and service. So it's about service work, which is a different sort of time. Literally, Filipinos in many parts of the world are hired to make time for others. Like literally make time. So at the same time that they're being paid for their time, Filipinos are also hired to make time and then spend time with other people.
So how did you get started on this topic?
So I think about 10 years ago was sort of the switch over, or rather sort of the waning part of, first, many people in New Jersey probably have known a nurse who works in a hospital who is Filipino, precisely because the Filipinos recruited because there was a nurse shortage in the 80s and 90s. And so, of course, there was particular bills that allowed accelerated entry of Filipino nurses into the United States. But then also, that created a demand in the Philippines for nursing students and nursing schools. But then that stopped all right, around the 2000s, 2005-ish or so. And then, of course, what also rose at the same time was call centers in the Philippines. So that what fascinated me was, of course, these enclaves who are of call centers throughout the night in Manila, in Cebu, and in larger cities in the Philippines, where people are actually servicing North American or global North customers at night, because of course it's 12 hours ahead in the Philippines, so they work at night, and we obviously are living our everyday lives in North America during the day. But then of course when you call, we are always calling at night. So that's what fascinated me about the way that you don't have to migrate anymore. And many of those call center agents were actually trained as nurses, precisely because they were directed to go into nursing because of a recruitment in the US and in Europe for nurses. But then that fell as a demand, and then other sort of like industries rose to replace it in some way. It overlapped. So that was the first thing that actually fascinated me about that.
You had a gradual awareness of this.
That's right.
Yeah. So how's your book structured?
So at first it's structured with different types of work, but also different genres. So that is to say, so I start off with a documentary film about teachers, Filipino teachers in Baltimore who are special education and science and math teachers. And then the next chapter is about domestic workers in Europe. And then the third chapter is about call center agents in the Philippines. And the fourth chapter is actually about Filipino caregivers in Israel. But each chapter, each case study actually treats a different genre of creative expression and cultural products. So whether it's a documentary film, and then the next one is short stories, and then the next one is actually an ethnography, and then the last one is actually a musical. So that's how I start to explore sort of like how time works in these different, number one, occupations or service work, but also the way that, people imagine themselves in this occupation or service work. How do they make time for others, and how do we imagine and feel time with each other?
Can you tell me a little bit more about these Filipino call centers, and how do they handle angry customers?
So, it's very difficult. For call center agents, of course, they not only they don't have to migrate physically out of the country, but they have to migrate temporally, or at least in time, within the same country. They could live with their families, but they're usually asleep when their families are awake, and they're usually working when their families are asleep. So number one, there's a migration in a different way within the 24-hour clock.
Yeah.
But also, call center agents are only given 5 minutes to solve your problem. And most of the time, we always get we only get the call center when we need something to be solved. Yes. So everyone is always in crisis whenever we get to a call center agent.
They're anxious. They're upset.
Always, always. And then of course,
even if not angry necessarily.
Not necessarily angry, but they're certainly anxious and upset. And then of course, Filipinos in the call centers actually then have to handle this on the other end. But whole industries have been built around this, right?
Yeah.
So not only sort of the call centers themselves, but then of course the breakfast places, the dinner places, the 24-hour service that actually then would feed the call center agents, and then the people who actually, the ancillary services that create these sort of mini cities within a city, which is fascinating to me, in the way that there's a different life within the city itself.
And following up on what you said before, how do you account for there's so many Filipino workers as caregivers overseas?
Right. Well, for one thing, precisely because of the colonization of the Philippines by the U.S. for 50 years, starting in 1898 after the Spanish-American War and onto World War II, right after the World War II, of course, the U.S. set up U.S. educational system, right? Before that, it was a Spanish education system where the primary language would be Spanish, but the primary language under the U.S., of course, would be English. So, of course, most everyone speaks English. And it's precisely because, number one, the English language, but number two, also the education system, which is patterned after the U.S., created a population, an English-speaking workforce that became sort of later a possibility for recruitment as far as caregivers is concerned. But also, it depends on which country. Canada, for example, recruits a lot of Filipino caregivers because, again, partly helped by the government. Israel also recruits a lot of Filipino caregivers for the elderly, and it's also partly in the 90s because of the privatization of healthcare in Israel. So it's a way by which, of course, that you don't need nursing homes anymore, or there are still nursing homes staffed by Filipinos, but also individual caregivers who live in the houses of the elderly there.
Changing the subject, say I'm a Filipina nurse, and I have a death in the family back in the Philippines, but it's very difficult for me to fly back to Manila to attend a funeral. How do the funeral homes in the Philippines deal with this sort of thing?
No, thank you for that question. And that actually, my epilogue actually deals with that as far as remote funerals are concerned. So during COVID, of course, unfortunately, it was devastating here in North America and the United States in the way that we can't actually meet our family and obligations in the United States when someone dies of COVID, with the thousands of deaths in the United States. And then so therefore Zoom funerals and memorials became commonplace here in the United States only in the last couple of years. But in the Philippines and in other migratory countries, remote funerals has been a fact of life for more than a decade. So in fact, St. Peter Chapels, which is one of the biggest network of funeral homes in the Philippines, has already installed and made possible in sort of the package that you buy for funerals, a camera and remote funeral service, so that people from abroad, if you're working in the Middle East or working in other parts of Asia or working in the US, if a family member dies, you log in, and then with your password, you go into the room, and then of course there's a particular camera in the actual the mourning space, and then of course you can then type in and log in or chat with relatives there. So since 2009, funeral homes have been outfitted with these cameras so that you can log into your computer. And it's a way by which you can meet your family obligation, and most of the time the person working abroad is one of the main breadwinners for the family. And of course these funerals are paid for by the people abroad, not everyone, but for them in most cases. So of course they have to meet their family obligation, not just pay for the funeral, but also be present. But many times they can't go back home because of laws or because the cost is so prohibitive. So therefore you can log in, and in this way it's become quite normalized in the Philippines to mourn with your family, but at a distance.
Now, I know writing a book takes a lot of work, but what do you enjoy most about the creative process?
I think going to the place and interviewing people has been really quite satisfying. And just really spending time with call center agents, with the directors, the writers, the actors, and all the creative places that people bring me to, whether in their own creative process or even just in the everyday. I think when I was actually interviewing call center agents, they would take me to all their activities one afternoon because they have bonding activities that they have to meet for the corporate, sort of like get corporate stickers or something. And so they would just invite me for lunch or for any of these activities like volleyball. And it really, just like in any ethnography, you have to spend time with the people you are writing about. And in one sense, you're always responsible to those people. That's what you're writing for in one sense, not just sort of extracting information out of them, but also being with. And that's one of the things that I want to stress in the book is about this quality, especially with care work. It's about being with people, right? And in one sense, our jobs as scholars and teachers is always about being with and creating time separately from what we think of as productive time, right? We always think it's time is money, But no, when you're actually inside the moment, it's a different world that you're creating with a student or with the folks that you're interviewing.
You have to be simpatico with
and I think you have to co-create. You know, in one sense, any book that's written is co-created and co-written by the people that you're writing about.
Yes. And on the other hand, what did you find most challenging about the creative process?
Well, number one, being responsible to the people that you were interviewing or speaking to. And I think it's also just the writing in general. How do you create a narrative out of a life story that's so complex and contradictory and also incoherent? Because we're responsible as writers and scholars to create a story, in a sense, an explanatory sort of mode that actually puts them together.
And so what you leave out is just as important as what you put in.
Absolutely. And then you always regret, obviously, what is it that I did leave out? And also because the writing takes a life of its own as well. Right? When you're writing, you think of other possibilities of how to tell this story. But it also means you do sacrifice other things as well. But at the end, it really is, does this get at a certain experience or truth that you and others have experienced?
In this work of doing the writing, does it energize you or does it exhaust you?
It depends on which stage of the writing. Because it really does, like looking at the blank page and having raw material is the worst thing possible. Like, where do you start?
Yeah.
You know, how do you put it together? These two things don't go together, but yet you have to create something out of nothing in one sense. There's a lot of somethings, but they're not connected. And I think the time when it energizes me is when I have a draft and that it actually, it's like, oh my gosh, there is a way to put this together.
It's starting to take shape.
It actually has this shape that actually is of its own. And therefore, that's really exciting.
Now, you said a moment ago that you enjoy interviewing people, you enjoy doing the field work, so to speak.
Right.
But how much research do you do before you start interviewing people?
Right, and I think you really have to, you can't go into the field cold. You really obviously have to know, well, you have to know a little bit about the industry. You have to know a little bit, and a lot actually, about what is meaningful to people. When you go to any field, it's going to be a different sort of sense of meaning making and sense of life, and the sense of order is very different from what you bring. And so therefore, knowing a sense of order, you know, their sense of order, what's important to them and to this place becomes very important. And you do have to do research on that. And also speaking a couple of languages helps. Because then you can code switch. It's important to code switch because then people would be comfortable. I remember my first interview with one agent says, I don't want to speak in English because for them, that was what they use for work. You know, and so they don't want to speak English with me because they've been doing that for 8-10 hours.
And they're tired.
And they're tired and they just want to be home and just chat. And so it's very different, right?
Yeah. I sympathize with the idea of having to do research before you go on the interview. I remember one time I was doing research on trucking, and I went to interview a trucking executive, and after about 5 minutes he said, come back when you know what you're talking about.
That's right.
So that was a lesson.
That's right, because you have to know what questions to ask. Because some questions don't mean anything and in fact are not important as far as they're concerned. Right.
We mentioned before you have to leave stuff out. In retrospect, can you remember something you had to leave out here?
Yeah, I'm trying to wonder. There are many conversations that I've had to leave out. I think conversations and even times when nothing is happening. Because I remember like being in Israel and just spending time, I was invited to lunch, just out of the blue. We were in a public car, a public bus, and a Filipino was saying, what are you doing now? And I said, nothing, I'm just going home. He's like, well, why don't you come with me and we can actually just have lunch at my house. And I said, really? Well, you have 10 minutes, I have 10 minutes to my house and you have 10 minutes to decide. And I just said, why not? And I just did, and of course they were already, because in Israel, many Filipinos would live in one place because they only have the weekends off, so maybe 10 people would share a place. And then here was, you know, people were already lunching, they were already drinking, there was already karaoke happening. And really those moments that are really special to people and to me had to be left out. But there were a lot of those moments when nothing particularly happens, but it really was very important.
A heartwarming experience.
Absolutely.
Why do you suppose there's so many Filipinos working overseas as musicians? I mean, I've seen this myself.
Right. I mean, entertainment industry, of course, is very important, especially if there is not much material. The chances, your chances in succeeding or making money or supporting your family. What do you have but raw talent, perhaps? And that's important. And that is, of course, transportable. I mean, hopefully. And so there's a lot of cover bands all over Asia, Filipino cover bands all over Asia, every cruise ship, of course, workers also Filipino.
Yeah.
And these are sort of like opportunities. Service work is about your body, you know. And if you don't have much to begin with, but you still have your body and the way your talents work. And so, but of course, one of the very first jazz musicians in Asia were Filipinos, performing in Japan and in Hong Kong clubs. And so that was back in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah.
You know, since American occupation, jazz music came in with American occupation, and Filipinos took that up, and then, of course, you know, established themselves to be fine musicians, you know, as well. Because there was already a music tradition, a Western music tradition in the Philippines, you know, as well as a native music tradition. So really, it's about the talent which leads people to go all over the place, all over Asia, all over Europe, all over the United States, and on cruise ships.
And painting with a broad brush, what does it mean when you have colonized people all over the entire world?
Well, it's really a difficult situation, right? Which is to say that, you know, people are trying to their best with underdevelopment, with the global south, with the conditions in the Philippines. It's like how best to create opportunities for yourself and for your family and supporting your family. And unfortunately for many Filipinos, it's really going abroad. I mean, simply, of course, there are very many rich families in the Philippines, as there are many rich families all over the world, but of course, that's about 1%. The 99% have to figure out how to fend for themselves. And it is a way by which, of course, different histories are carried in the body. Right? Whether it's English in the form of English as a history, whether it's our Spanish last names or Chinese names that we carry with ourselves. So with each sort of like, you know, person going abroad, they also bring with them all these histories, you know, long histories precisely of what makes a Filipino, which is a very complicated thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's not one thing. It's 7,000 islands. It's 60 to 70 ethno-linguistic groups. It's many languages all at once. It's always living in translation, in one sense.
And still painting again with a broad brush, how have Filipinos adapted to capitalism?
And I think that's what we're speaking to right now, right? In the way that labor contracts, of course, are traded, bartered, bought, expanded, et cetera, and then of course these are opportunities. You know, and they're not the best opportunities, of course not. But it is to say that, again, people are thinking really not necessarily in the broad sense, but really in a very specific sense of like how to just get by. And any opportunity precisely that would take their talents and bodies elsewhere to earn a living, that's an opportunity. Right? And again, we're talking about 99% of the world, not just the Philippines, but 99% of the world that really has to fend for themselves.
And who's the target audience for your book, would you say?
First, with the title, of course, Filipinos will get the title immediately. But I think it's also people who actually study culture, study migration, study labor, people who are actually interested in different ways of how people in their everyday lives imagine their own lives, despite the fact that whole lifetimes are traded to go abroad, but yet they're able to live their lives very richly from moment to moment. You know, so anyone actually thinking about American life, thinking about like migratory life, I think would be interested in the book.
And did you draw largely on anthropology? Did you draw on literature? What discipline was dominant?
Right. My approach has always been, of course, because I'm trained in close reading, in scholarship, and discourse analysis. So mostly it's mostly in literature that and also in cultural studies. Most of the time, it's cultural studies in the way that I sort of read, whether it's reading film, documentary film, or whether it's reading short stories, or whether it's talking about a musical theater. So there's an agglomeration of performance studies, film studies, literary studies, and also anthropology, cultural anthropology, especially when I'm thinking about ethnography, as you suggest.
And I remember attending a seminar where you featured your book at Rutgers University. In general, have you been pleased with the reception of your book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the way by which we understand not people not just in a national sense, but in a transnational sense, or a diasporic way, because Filipinos have relatives everywhere. That is to say, I have cousins in Australia and Europe and the Middle East, and also in other parts of Asia. But yet we still somehow maintain a thread on Facebook or in Messenger in the way that we mediate our way of living as a family, right? Or an extended family through these mediated technologies, right? Mediated by technology. So I think that's not unusual for Filipinos to live, that their extended family is both mediated through technology and also it's all over the world. So how can you understand yourself, not just by nationality, I'm an American, but then I'm also related to all these people in the rest of the world, but yet I understand them intimately as my cousins. So it is very, it's not unusual, but I think it's a way I think this book tries to get at that idea.
Well, as you know, I come from a military family, and one of my grandfathers was involved with the Philippine insurrection. So I'm very mindful that the U.S. colonized the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And so I want to ask a sort of philosophical question. Would the Philippines have been better off if the U.S. had never colonized the Philippines?
Well, that's a very hard question to ask. I mean, obviously, that episode in history is a very painful one. Many Filipinos died during the Philippine-American War, and the Philippines thought the Americans were coming to help them, but it was not the case, right? So about 250,000 Filipinos died during that war. So I'm never quite sure how to answer questions where it's like, if this did not happen, what would be good? But for one thing, maybe it would be several different countries. Maybe the southern Philippines is a different country from the northern Philippines, or maybe it's a federation, or maybe it's another way to think about sort of ways to belong to each other. And I think, the idea of being Filipino, as I said before, is very complicated given the sort of disparate nature of the islands, archipelago, and also the different types of people that live in the Philippines. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to answer that. What we acknowledge is precisely that it did happen. It did create this sort of dispersal that we have now, with 10% of Filipinos living and supporting families from abroad.
Yeah. And I would say, what's the best way to market this book? How do you reach a wider audience?
I think it's, again, what does it mean to be someone whose primary work is about caring for other people, right? And I think that's sort of interesting because in the United States, of course, we don't produce objects anymore. That's always abroad. So most people in the United States are actually doing sort of a different type of labor, right? And so that type of labor is about your body and yourself and actually interacting with other people. You're not producing an object like a cup we don't work in factories, most of us. But yet, so what does that mean? So I think the way to reach an audience is precisely, how do we spend our time then? If it's about other people, it's about relationships, and it's about making time for others. That I think is, to say that that's what the book is trying to do, I think reaches a wider audience. And it also reaches, of course, other sort of immigrant communities that experience the same thing.
It's a fascinating book, but I'm curious, how long did it take you to write it?
Oh, forever. Oh my gosh.
From start to finish?
From start to finish, I think I started interviewing, I was in Israel in 2008, I was in the Philippines in 2011. Different versions of it came out in article form during that time. And then it probably took another, itself, the writing took about 2 years. I think that was sort of one of the things about COVID was that we were all at home.
Yeah.
We were at home and we were very productive, many of us, some of us, if we didn't suffer the tragedies of it all. There was a way that you were able to commune with your own thoughts and materials. And so many people met deadlines during COVID. And I think, so I think primarily about 2 or 3 years is the main writing time.